Okay, so as we unravel this book, The Mystical Laws, we're stepping into a truly profound framework that claims to reveal the ultimate hidden truth of the universe. Today's explanator focuses entirely on the very first chapter, which is all about life after death. And honestly, whether you approach this as a spiritual seeker or just someone who loves a good thought experiment, the architecture of the afterlife presented here is absolutely fascinating.
Right off the bat, the text makes a really bold promise. It states, and I quote, "Once you start reading, your common sense will crumble in an hour." The author argues that our schools and the mainstream media have absolutely failed to teach us the real truth about our existence. We're taught that life is just this temporary, strictly biological thing. But this book, it asks us to literally flip that entire perspective upside down.
So it begs the ultimate question, doesn't it? If death isn't actually the end, well, how should we be living right now? I mean, if we are inherently spiritual beings who are just having a temporary physical experience, knowing that changes absolutely everything about our daily choices. It completely shatters our preconceived notions and sets up a really urgent, practical framework for how we navigate our lives today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our 6-step map for today's explainer. First, redefining our common sense. Then, the moment of death. Next, the 49-day transition. After that, heaven and hell divided. Then we'll look at this world as training. And finally, letting go of attachments.
All right, starting with Section 1, redefining our common sense and the reality that we are fundamentally spiritual beings.
To really grasp this, we've got to stop viewing ourselves as bodies that happen to have souls. Actually, scratch that. It's more like we need to see ourselves as spiritual entities who are just temporarily wearing physical suits. The text introduces this through the out-of-body experience, when the soul separates from the physical body. And you know, it's not some terrifying detachment. Surprisingly, people often describe a sensation of flight. It's like Peter Pan, literally zipping through the air. Defining this early on really helps us understand the vocabulary of the soul moving totally independently of our physical form.
Moving right along to Section 2, the moment of death, which turns out to be a surprisingly structured transition. So what actually happens when the physical body expires? Well, it definitely isn't just a sudden blackout. It's a step-by-step process of shedding earthly layers. First, the soul leaves the physical body. But it doesn't just immediately float up to the highest heavens. It's still wearing what the book calls an astral body, which resonates with dense earthly frequencies. To ascend higher, the soul actually has to shed this astral layer. The text compares it to taking off a suit of heavy iron armor. Only then can it ascend as a pure, lightweight spirit body. It brilliantly illustrates just how heavy and limiting our earthly layers actually are.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 49-day transition. This is an absolutely crucial hovering period.
This concept is deeply rooted in ancient spiritual teachings, so let's map out the timeline. On day 1, death occurs and the soul slowly realizes its new state. Over the first few weeks, the soul often just hovers near the earthly plane, maybe visiting loved ones or places it was really attached to. But by day 49, the soul absolutely must make its final departure to the afterlife. The text stresses that wrapping up your earthly reflections and firmly leaving by the 49th day is absolutely essential to avoid becoming a wandering spirit just stuck and attached to the physical world.
The text also touches on tragic circumstances, specifically suicide, with a lot of directness and empathy. It notes that suicidal souls often don't even realize they are dead, simply because they lack that spiritual knowledge in life. And because of that, they find themselves endlessly repeating their tragic final actions, like jumping off a building over and over again, feeling the physical impact, reforming, and jumping again. It's a continuous loop until they finally awaken to the fact that they are spiritual beings. It's a really sobering look at why understanding our spiritual nature is presented as so vital.
Okay, Section 4, Heaven and Hell Divided, looking at the grand macro architecture of the universe.
Now, what's really interesting about this history is that heaven and hell weren't always strictly separated. In ancient times, they actually shared a sort of coexisting space. But as human ego and earthly desires multiplied, hell's population literally exploded. The negativity got so incredibly dense that the realms had to be firmly isolated and structurally divided from one another.
And this perfectly illustrates the contrast between the two realms today. Heaven is described as being constantly bathed in beautiful spiritual sunlight, matching high-frequency wavelengths of love and selflessness. Hell, on the other hand, it's dark. It's completely covered by thick rain clouds of dense, bad thoughts. And you know, these aren't your typical weather clouds. The text explains they are literally made up of the negative attachments of humans, completely blacking out the spiritual sun.
So how exactly do we travel to these respective places? Well, the source aligns with a lot of near-death accounts describing these dimensional tunnels. Depending on a soul's wavelength, it's either going to enter a tunnel that ascends swiftly up into the light, or, for those weighed down by negativity, they take a downward drop. It's almost like a super fast elevator going straight toward the center of the earth, right into the darkness.
That leads us right into Section 5, This World as Training. It's a high-intensity arena.
You might be wondering, if the afterlife is so vast and permanent, why do souls even bother coming to this dense physical world at all? Well, the author states, the physical world is a very good training ground to truly understand spiritual freedom. Earth is intentionally difficult, guys. It's a high-intensity training arena. Because the spiritual world is so fluid and free, souls can actually get a bit complacent, so they willingly choose to endure the gravity, the friction, and the sheer hardships of the physical world because it provides the ultimate contrast to help them truly appreciate and earn that spiritual freedom.
And here is a massive takeaway for you, the ultimate spiritual ROI. The author explains that because this physical world is just so heavy and challenging, the spiritual return on investment here is absolutely wild. Get this, one single year of deep self-reflection and progress in this difficult physical world equals a massive 10 years of spiritual progress in the afterlife. It completely reframes our earthly struggles, doesn't it? They're incredibly valuable opportunities.
And finally, Section 6, Letting Go, Shedding Those Earthly Weights.
So how do we ensure a smooth transition when our time actually comes? Well, the crucial point is this. Earthly attachments, our human ego and worldly desires, act as literal heavy weights. It's like a giant hot air balloon. It just can't rise if it's tied to the ground with heavy sandbags. A soul that's completely obsessed with money or status or holding on to grudges is simply too heavy to ascend. Those attachments anchor the soul right down to the lower realms.
The source gets really specific here about the heavy emotions we need to drop, things like anger, jealousy, and hatred, or worry, suffering, and agony. Indulging in these feelings absolutely plummets your spiritual wavelength. In fact, the text warns that vibrating at these low frequencies is basically an open door. It makes you super susceptible to negative spiritual influences or even possession by unfulfilled spirits. No way you want that, right?
Remember, when you eventually transition to the afterlife, you basically become a spiritual baby again. You definitely can't take your bank account, your job titles, or your physical possessions with you. You can only take your mind and the distilled essence of your experiences. All that other trivial earthly stuff we stress over every single day, it literally does not exist there. Clinging to it only causes you suffering.
So, the text leaves us with this really compelling call to action. Rebuild what you can of your life before returning to the other world. It's a huge reminder to use the rest of our time here on Earth for course correction. We're encouraged to shed that ego, dive into some deep self-reflection, and really clean up our internal world while we still have that incredible 10 times leverage of the physical plane.
I want to leave you with a lingering, kind of provocative thought to chew on today. Based on this whole profound spiritual framework we just mapped out, look at your own life. What earthly attachments, what heavy sandbags are you ready to let go of today? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating explainer with me. Keep learning, keep reflecting, and I'll catch you next time.
All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're taking all those Hollywood horror myths you've seen in the movies and throwing them out the window. We're replacing them with something way more fascinating, the highly logical, systemic rules behind spiritual possession. You know, when most of us hear the word possession, we instantly picture spinning heads and complete, total chaos. But what if I told you the unseen world actually operates on incredibly strict, predictable scientific principles? We're going to dive deep into the exact mechanisms of how the spiritual world actually overlaps with our own.
So right off the bat, I want you to just pause for a second. Seriously, audit your thoughts right now. How are you feeling in this exact moment? Are you stressed out, feeling a little resentful about something, or are you feeling grateful? It brings up a very literal question. Are you tuning into a negative frequency? Because according to the material we're looking at today, there is a totally unseen world of spiritual frequencies constantly overlapping with our daily lives. And guess what? Your mind is the antenna picking up the signal.
This whole concept comes directly from an absolutely fascinating book called The Mystical Laws. And what's so cool about this text is how it completely grounds the supernatural into our everyday reality. It doesn't treat the spirit world like it's some sort of spooky magic. Instead, it frames it as a hidden science with its own literal set of physics. The core argument here is that by actually understanding these laws, we can take real, practical steps to protect ourselves. Okay, so to truly grasp this, we've got to define the core mechanism of possession first. Chapter 2 of the text calls this overshadowing. And this happens when a spirit comes along and overlaps with the soul that's currently living inside a physical body. It essentially acts as a secondary shadow. It's a literal overlapping, sometimes double or even triple layers deep, of two distinct but mathematically very similar souls. But you might be wondering, how in the world did those two souls find each other in the first place? Well, the text proposes that the human mind basically acts like a giant electromagnet. You, me, everyone, we are all essentially walking human magnets. Every single thought, every emotion, every intention we have is constantly sending out a specific magnetic charge. And that charge literally pulls in corresponding entities straight from the spirit world. Which brings us to the absolute cornerstone of everything we're talking about today, the law of same wavelengths. If you want to prevent possession, this is the absolute rule you have to know. This law dictates that you can only attract what matches your exact mental frequency. An outside spirit, it can't just attach to you randomly. No way. They can only overshadow you if your mental wavelength is a perfect match to theirs. The author uses a brilliant, super relatable metaphor to explain this. Think of a television or an FM radio. How does a TV work? Well, broadcast stations are firing signals all around you, literally right through the room you're sitting in right now. But you only get the picture and the sound if your dial is specifically tuned to their channel. The spiritual world works the exact same way. Stations in heaven and hell are broadcasting 24/7, but you only receive their influence if you tune your personal dial to their specific channel. Actually, let me just read this quote straight from the text because it really hammers the idea home. Spirits from the heavenly and hellish realms emit different wavelengths. If a person on Earth matches that wavelength, they connect. Boom. It really is that straightforward. Spiritual overshadowing isn't some random lightning strike of bad luck. It is simply a successful, established connection between your internal dial and an external broadcast. So let's look at the stark difference between these two states of mind. It's practically night and day. On one side, you've got a high-frequency mind. This is powered by gratitude, harmony, and peace. But on the flip side, a low-frequency mind is bogged down by jealousy, constant complaints, and a victim mentality. If you're living your life trapped in those negative emotions, you are actively tuning your receiver to a hostile broadcast. You're practically inviting it in. Let's get a bit more specific on those low-frequency triggers. Because, let's be honest, these are super common everyday habits for a lot of people. Things like envy and jealousy toward a friend, voicing constant complaints, blaming your parents or your boss for where you are in life, just sitting in that victim mentality, or even holding on to incredibly strong attachments to worldly success and grudges. The text identifies these specific mindsets as open invitations. They create the exact wavelength that lets negative spirits connect to you and basically amplify your misery. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. The mental aspect, that's actually only half the battle. Even if your mind is perfectly harmonized, totally positive, and doing great, if you are severely physically exhausted, that actually blocks out heavenly light and leaves you spiritually vulnerable. You simply cannot separate the physical body from your spiritual defenses. They are a package deal. Let's break down how this physical-spiritual connection actually works in practice. When you're in a state of chronic exhaustion, running on fumes, you block the higher energy, basically rolling out the red carpet for negative entities. Plus, when you have physical pain or a localized illness, it creates literal weak spots in your body's energy field. The text actually notes that these weak spots, often located at traditional acupressure points, sometimes called tsubo, can attract lower-tier entities, like animal spirits, to attach right to the exact area where you were hurting. Okay, so how do we fix this vulnerability? The source is super practical about this, dividing the solutions into temporary fixes and true fixes. Sure, you can use Eastern medicine, eat some garlic, or take ginseng. Those can give you a quick jolt of spiritual energy, kind of like a temporary shield. But the true absolute non-negotiable fix? Deep rest, proper nutrition, and just getting enough sleep. You absolutely cannot maintain a strong spiritual defense if you're physically running on empty. Which brings us to the ultimate solution presented in the book. The creation of a kekai. Kekai is a Japanese term for a spiritual barrier or boundary. And as it's defined here, it's a conscious perimeter you create specifically to protect against the invasion of negative or evil spirits. It's all about actively, intentionally establishing a safe zone around yourself. And just to show you this isn't just some abstract theory, look at how humans have historically built kekkai for centuries. Shinto shrines use sacred ropes called shimenawa to block out negative energy. Sumo wrestling rings? They are meticulously outlined with salt and rope to completely purify the space before a match even begins. Religious sanctuaries and temples all over the world are essentially built as physical manifestations of these protective spiritual boundaries. So, taking a cue from all that history, how do you and I build an actionable, modern lifestyle barrier today? Well, it boils down to 3 steps. First, discard those negative mindsets we talked about and actively harmonize your mind. Second, prioritize restoring your physical health through real rest. And third, practice right faith and engage in continuous spiritual study. That third step is a total game changer because you can literally turn your own home into a spiritual fortress. The author points out that by actively reading truth-based books, watching positive media, and practicing self-reflection right in your living space, you generate a massive amount of powerful energy. That energy acts exactly like those sacred ropes we just talked about, creating an impenetrable kekkai right inside your house that naturally repels any outside negativity. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this one pivotal question to think about today. What channel is your mental remote control tuned to right now? Remember the law of same wavelengths. You hold all the power here. You can change the channel at literally any moment by shifting away from complaints and jealousy and by finally giving your physical body the profound rest it needs. Take back control of your dial today, build your barrier, and protect your frequency. Thanks for diving into this fascinating material with me, and keep your signals strong.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are unpacking some truly fascinating stuff, the highly detailed mechanics of spirit communication, specifically drawing from Chapter 3 of our source text. We aren't just talking about generic ghost stories here. The author actually lays out a highly structured, almost scientific framework for exactly how the unseen world interacts with ours. We're going to break down these concepts step by step so we can really understand this complex spiritual architecture.
So, how do spirits actually communicate with our physical world? That right there is the central mystery we are exploring today. And we're framing this not just as some abstract philosophical question, but as a practical, technical, and historical problem that the source material literally attempts to solve. The text argues that bridging the gap between dimensions requires incredibly specific conditions, a deep understanding of human consciousness, and, surprisingly, a whole lot of historical groundwork.
To get a grip on all this, here is our roadmap for the explainer. 1. The 150-year spiritual plan. 2. The mechanics of spirit communication. 3. The iron armor of flesh. And 4. The 2 wheels of religion.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the 150-year spiritual plan, and how it aimed to prove the unseen.
Okay, so looking right at Chapter 3 of the source text, it frames the dawn of modern spiritualism not as a bunch of random spooky occurrences, but as a highly deliberate strategy. It outlines what it calls a 150-year plan, and the ultimate goal here, to basically force humanity to acknowledge that the unseen world actually exists. According to the author, the spiritual realm realized they needed a systematic, overwhelming approach to finally break through modern materialism.
And the timeline of how this plan supposedly unfolded is pretty wild. It kicks off way back in 1848 in New York with the Fox sisters and their famous rapping poltergeist phenomena. Think loud physical knocks that were just impossible to ignore. But the text notes that this physical phase was really just phase 1. Then we move into the scientific era in the late 19th century, where you have highly respected scientists like Sir William Crookes actually studying materialized spiritual energy, ectoplasm, in a lab setting. From there, in the early 20th century, the movement gained serious intellectual backing from massive literary figures like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The source argues this was a highly coordinated effort across decades to drop undeniable, multi-layered proof of life after death right into our laps.
Moving right along to Section 2, the mechanics of spirit communication, or as I like to think of it, tuning the dial. If the spiritual world is actively trying to communicate, how does the tech actually work? Well, the text boils it all down to the law of same wavelengths. It uses this amazing modern metaphor. It says the human mind acts just like an electromagnet, or a TV and FM radio dial. You simply cannot receive a broadcast if you aren't tuned to the exact right frequency. A person's inner thoughts and spiritual state emit a very specific wavelength, and they will naturally attract and connect with spirits vibrating at that precise, identical frequency. It's totally systemic. If the channel doesn't match perfectly, the audio simply won't come through.
Now this brings up a super interesting answer to a question skeptics always ask. The author explains why high-level, advanced spirits often hide their identities, using pseudonyms or speaking totally anonymously. Why do that? Because attempting to definitively prove who you were 2,000 or 3,000 years ago is basically an impossible headache in our physical world. It just leads to endless, completely unproductive background checks by skeptics. By remaining anonymous, these higher entities essentially force the receiver, and humanity as a whole, to focus entirely on the actual value and truth of the message itself, rather than getting totally sidetracked by the messenger's historical identity.
Which brings us to Section 3, the iron armor of flesh and the heavy burden of the physical body.
Because here's the thing, even if those wavelengths match perfectly, there is still a massive physical barrier in the way: us. There's this incredibly striking quote in the text that vividly captures how a high spirit actually views the human body. From a higher dimension, trying to enter or interact with our physical form is just incredibly burdensome. It's described as being weighed down by a heavy iron armor. The text likens the experience to a spirit trying to operate inside one of those dense, restrictive, vintage deep sea diver suits, or like a crab just heavily trudging along the dark ocean floor. The vibrational difference is just way too vast for a simple, direct connection.
So, because of this heavy physical armor, direct communication from the very highest realms is super rare. Instead, it requires a step-down mechanism. First, the high spirit formulates the message, but they don't deliver it directly to the human. They use a mediator. An intermediary, or usually a person's guardian spirit, someone just a bit closer to the physical realm's lower dimensions, acts as a translator. They catch that high-frequency message, safely step down the spiritual voltage so it's comprehensible, and then they gently relay that transmission to the human medium.
All right, on to our final section, Part 4, the two wheels of religion, and how we actually maintain this connection. So practically speaking, how do we keep this super fragile connection alive? The text uses a really relatable metaphor here. Imagine you have a direct phone line to the spiritual realms. The problem is our daily worldly distractions. The constant barrage of phones ringing, the endless flood of emails, and yes, apparently even faxes, all of this creates massive static on the line. And that interference drags the mind's wavelength down, which naturally invites unwanted interference from lower, more worldly spirits.
To actually cut through that static, the text insists we have to balance two opposing practices, which act as the dual wheels driving religious life. On one side, we have okamori, which translates to spiritual recharging through deep seclusion and meditation. This is the act of silencing the static and generating those calm, receptive alpha waves. But on the flip side, we have missionary work, or worldly action. This is the active transmission of the spiritual light you've received out into society. You cannot just soak it all up. You have to actively engage and spread the message.
But, and this is a huge warning in the text, leaning too far in either direction is incredibly dangerous. If you do too much okomori, you risk extreme isolation. You basically become a hermit who achieves personal peace but helps absolutely no one else. Conversely, if you focus entirely on worldly action and spreading the word without ever stopping to meditate and recharge, your spiritual work just degrades into a corporate business. Your spiritual battery goes completely dead. Keeping a true, sustainable, high-level connection absolutely demands the discipline of both retreating to recharge and stepping forward to act.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought straight from the source material. We've talked about all these complex mechanics of the unseen, but the core requirement here is intensely personal. The text challenges us to look at our own daily lives. In our hyper-connected modern world, buzzing with constant static and heavy physical demands, how do you balance recharging your inner energy with taking action in the modern world? It's definitely a profound question to chew on. Thanks so much for exploring this with me.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are getting into some absolutely mind-bending territory. We're looking at a fascinating chapter called Occultism as Power, from the source text, The Mystical Laws. Our goal here is to just lay out the author's exact arguments and explore a worldview that completely flips the script on what we consider real. So let's just get right into it. To kick things off, the text poses a really wild question right out of the gate. What if our entire universe is literally just a fish tank? The author uses this brilliant metaphor of humanity living our day-to-day lives exactly like goldfish trapped inside a glass tank. Think about it. You live your whole life in this tiny, water-filled box, swimming around thinking, yep, I've got it all figured out. Meanwhile, you're completely oblivious to this massive, complex reality operating right on the other side of the glass. It's a pretty funny image, but man, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
And this analogy perfectly captures what the source is getting at. See, inside the tank, that's our three-dimensional reality. It's boxed in by physical laws, the gravel and the water we breathe. But outside that tank, that is a limitless, unseen spiritual dimension. The text actually argues that our strict physical-only worldview is an illusion that's isolating us from a much larger reality. We're essentially the goldfish, absolutely convinced that the water and the plastic castle are the whole shebang.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to look at the fish tank illusion, uncover the true meaning of the occult, trace the roots of mystical thought, and then connect all that to UFOs and spiritual science. Finally, we'll talk about awakening spiritual organs and breaking common sense limits.
All right, starting with part 1, the fish tank illusion, and how we are trapped by common sense.
The author of the Mystical Laws actually drops a pretty massive warning right in the preface. They basically say, if you read this book, your conventional common sense is going to completely collapse within the first hour. No joke. The material is literally designed to shatter the boundaries of what normal schooling and media tell us, arguing that we just haven't been given the whole truth about the universe. Going back to that goldfish metaphor, the text paints this really vivid picture. Imagine one little goldfish manages to jump out of the water for just a split second. It catches a quick glimpse of the living room, the couch, the TV, and then splashes back down. If that fish tries to tell its buddies about this crazy outside world, they'd completely laugh it off. They'd be like, dude, you just jumped and hallucinated. That's impossible. The author uses this to explain exactly why we struggle so much to accept higher dimensions. We just lack the context, kind of like those skeptical little fish.
Moving on to part 2, meaning of the occult and redefining what that actually means. Okay, so this is a crucial point. When we hear the word occult today, what do we think of? Horror movies, dark magic, spooky rituals in the woods, right? But the text actively pushes back on that. It points out that the word occult literally translates from Latin as just hidden things. That's it. The text frames occultism simply as the study of those hidden truths. It's the reality operating right outside our fish tank. And that's a huge shift, right? Because it turns the occult from something scary into this empowering field of lost spiritual knowledge that anyone can tap into.
Up next, part 3, the roots of mystical thought and its historical foundation. So the author traces the lineage of this hidden knowledge way back to ancient Egypt, specifically to the Thoth Hermes framework. The idea here is that back then, people supposedly understood that humans could travel back and forth between this physical world and the spirit world. This Hermetic thought didn't just die out either. It survived the Middle Ages, secretly preserved by groups like the Rosicrucians. And then, and I find this part super fascinating, the text claims this spiritual science actually laid the groundwork for modern science. It points straight to Copernicus and his heliocentric theory. The author's argument is that mysticism and science weren't always fighting each other. They actually share the exact same roots of trying to figure out universal truths.
Which brings us to part 4, UFOs and spiritual science. Let's look at some modern paranormal events.
All right, according to the text, extraterrestrial crots are not just flying through physical space like a conventional airplane. Instead, they navigate these unseen spiritual routes. The idea is that when they enter our 3D world, they materialize. That's when they suddenly pop up on our physical radar. But when they want to leave, they don't just zoom off into the clouds. They literally dematerialize back into the spiritual realm, completely vanishing from all our instruments. It's a really specific, structured way of explaining how interdimensional travel might theoretically work. And this concept apparently extends to close encounters, too. The text talks about the physical anomalies that happen during UFO abductions. Think about the reports where people say they were pulled right through solid physical barriers, like closed windows or walls, using some kind of tractor beam. The source compares this directly to the mechanics of an out-of-body experience. It suggested in those moments, the normal limits of the physical body are just completely bypassed by advanced spiritual technology. Okay, this is where the text brilliantly ties it all back to our opening metaphor. Imagine how a UFO abduction would look to the other goldfish in the tank. The text compares it to a giant human hand reaching into the water, scooping up a fish, pulling it out into the unseen world, and then dropping it back in. To the fish that got abducted, it was this terrifying, totally incomprehensible experience. But to the other fish, the ones who literally cannot perceive the hand outside the tank, to them, their friend just vanished into thin air and then magically reappeared. Of course they're going to think the story sounds crazy.
Part 5 now, awakening spiritual organs, or looking at our spiritual anatomy.
So the big question is, how do we interact with this hidden world? Well, the author breaks down how we can supposedly awaken our own spiritual organs. First up is the space between the eyebrows. The text describes this as the center for spiritual vision and creative willpower, where you might perceive a profound white light. Then, moving down to the heart. The claim here is that the heart functions entirely differently. It's highly sensitive to external emotions and the spiritual power of other people. And finally, we go deeper down to the lower abdomen, also known as the dantian. This represents our deep spiritual center and the very core of our human life force. The text claims that by developing each of these unique centers, we can literally start to perceive the world outside the glass. And our final section, Part 6, Breaking Common Sense Limits and Unlocking Our Potential. Now, you might be wondering, what's the ultimate goal of all this? The fish tank, the occult, the spiritual organs? It's not just philosophical curiosity. The source text makes it absolutely clear the ultimate aim is for us to realize that humanity is currently operating on just a tiny fraction of its true potential. We feel completely trapped by our 3D common sense, but the author is emphatically saying, hey, we really don't have to be. In fact, I want to read this really powerful quote directly from the source material. It says, "Occultism and mystical thought have the power to encourage people, break through limits, and awaken the original power that has been confined to 1/10 of its capacity." The author is really driving home the point that mystical thinking isn't just some escapist fantasy. It's meant to be a profound tool for personal liberation. It's about unlocking that other 90% of our capacity that is just sitting there completely dormant. So I want to leave you with this really provocative thought as we wrap up today's explainer. If the author is right, and you are honestly only using 1/10 of your reality, if you're constrained by the so-called common sense of the physical world, well, what happens when you finally awaken the rest of that capacity? What happens when you finally look outside the fish tank? It's a pretty amazing question to ponder. Thank you guys so much for joining me today on this explainer. Keep questioning everything, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are going to impartially unpack some truly paradigm-shifting concepts presented in Chapter 5 of the Mystical Laws, specifically focusing on the profound question of what it genuinely means to believe. We'll be exploring how the source text frames shedding our worldly ego and harnessing the sheer power of belief as the ultimate mechanisms required to literally transcend dimensions. If you've ever felt that tension, between achieving worldly success and seeking deeper spiritual meaning, well, the philosophy outlined in this chapter tackles that exact paradox head-on.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the paths of guiding spirits, then we'll look at reversing worldly values, explore Muga or the selfless path, and finally, we'll unpack the power to believe. Let's get right into it.
Starting off with Section 1, Paths of Guiding Spirits.
To truly grasp this philosophy, the text asks us to look closely at highly advanced souls, or what it calls guiding spirits of light. When these spirits actually manifest in our physical, three-dimensional world, their lives usually take one of three distinct paths. The first is, well, often tragic. They're so spiritually advanced, so far ahead of their time, that they go completely unrecognized until long after their death. The second path is a spirit who finds some success but faces intense worldly frustration, so they shift their focus entirely to leaving spiritual teachings behind. And the third, that's the rare soul who possesses both immense spiritual insight and the practical capabilities to achieve massive recognition in their own era.
Now, the text uses this incredibly poignant metaphor to describe that second path. It paints a really vivid picture of a spirit enduring intense worldly frustration, yet agonizingly spinning out spiritual teachings for future generations. Kind of like a silkworm spinning its thread. It's a powerful visual, right? Enduring physical hardship for the sake of a higher, lasting legacy.
So this sets up a massive contrast. What our three-dimensional world labels as a flat-out failure, or frustration, or even a tragic life, is actually framed by this philosophy as a profound spiritual mission successfully completed. It completely flips the script and challenges us to reconsider how we actually measure a successful life.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, Reversing Worldly Values.
This structural contradiction brings up a totally fascinating question. Think about it. If these guiding spirits possess such incredibly high cognitive and spiritual power, why do their lives so often lack what we would call worldly success? It's designed to challenge our baseline assumptions about what it actually means to thrive.
The answer, according to the text, lies in an intentional paradigm shift. The philosophy argues that true spiritual development requires the exact opposite of what our physical society demands.
The world tells us to build our ego, accumulate wealth, embrace survival of the fittest. But the spiritual values presented here, they demand selflessness, letting go, and actively shedding that very ego. To succeed in one realm almost guarantees a perceived failure in the other.
Moving right along to Section 3, Muga, the selfless path. This dramatic reversal of values centers around a core Buddhist concept heavily highlighted in the chapter, Muga. Muga is essentially the absolute antidote to the worldly ego. Interestingly, the text makes a really fascinating psychological observation here. It points out that this ego naturally begins forming around the age of 10 as a necessary survival mechanism. It protects us in a competitive physical world. But while it keeps us physically safe, that same ego eventually hardens into a spiritual cage that limits our true potential.
And this brilliantly illustrates the central paradox of the chapter. To the worldly eye, practicing selflessness looks like you're losing. You might appear weak or like an easy target. But spiritually speaking, shedding this lower self, or throwing away the self, is presented as the absolute prerequisite. It's the only actual way to gain the higher self and achieve true self-realization.
In fact, the text posits an incredible spiritual return on investment. It suggests that the person who throws away the most worldly attachment actually gains the most. By operating from a place of complete selflessness, the source claims you can multiply your given life force and spiritual impact 10, 100, or even 1,000 times over. It's this massive multiplier effect born entirely from just letting go. And finally, we arrive at Section 4, the power to believe.
Everything we've discussed so far acts as preparation for the ultimate goal outlined by the author, which is breaking through what are called dimensional walls. The entire philosophy builds toward this singular, monumental capability of merging the physical world with the spiritual one. The text argues that an ordinary, ego-driven person simply cannot break this barrier. It requires the sheer, profound power to believe. Notice the specific word choice used here. Belief acts as the weapon to cross the wall between this world and the next. So belief here isn't just a passive feeling, it's an active, powerful, tearing force. To summarize, this structural journey we've been on, transcending these dimensions requires a rigorous, step-by-step evolution. First, one must utilize the power to endure. That means enduring physical hardships and worldly misunderstandings without holding on to resentment. Second, one must systematically empty oneself of the worldly ego through the practice of muga. And finally, having cleared away that lower self, one can fully activate and wield the power of belief to merge with the higher dimensions.
So, we'll leave you with this rather provocative thought to consider regarding your own worldview. If belief is the tool required to break the dimensional wall, what worldly attachments might be keeping your own walls intact? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the philosophy of the mystical laws. We'll catch you in the next explainer.